The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the quiet street as I stood there, hands raised against the cold metal of the police cruiser. The officer's grip on my arm tightened, his fingers pressing into the fabric of my jacket. I could feel the weight of his gaze, sizing me up like I was some kind of joke, something he could toss aside. "You think you're tough, huh?" he muttered, his voice dripping with mockery. I said nothing. I knew better than to respond, especially when I could feel the anger simmering beneath my calm exterior. But he didn't seem to care. His smirk only grew wider, like he had all the power in the world. "You're going to be a real problem tonight, aren't you?" I could feel the burn in my chest, the heat of the moment mixing with a deep-seated frustration. But I kept my breath steady, keeping my gaze focused on the pavement beneath my feet. The man seemed to be enjoying the moment, clearly feeling superior. His partner, a younger officer standing by the door of the cruiser, shot me a glance, one that looked almost apologetic, but he quickly looked away, not wanting to show any sign of weakness in front of his colleague. The older officer clicked his handcuffs into place with a deliberate slowness, as though it was all some kind of game to him. I knew I had to stay calm. It was just another moment in a lifetime of moments like this. The weight of history pressing down on us all, but I wasn't going to let him win. I'd been through worse. The question was, would he? The officer leaned in, whispering with a hint of amusement in his tone, "You're not even worth the trouble, but I guess it's my job to teach you a lesson." I said nothing, waiting for him to make the next move. I didn't need to say anything. Not yet. His smile, though, was starting to look more like a sneer. The laughter bubbled up from his chest like it was the most natural thing in the world. He shook his head, still holding me by the arm, pulling me roughly toward the back of the cruiser. His grip was tight, almost too tight, like he was trying to prove something. "You know," he said, still chuckling, "I've seen your type around here before. Thought you might be different, but looks like I was wrong." His voice dripped with condescension, the way he spoke to me like I was something beneath him, a nuisance he could simply brush off. It stung more than I wanted to admit. But I still said nothing, letting the words slide off me like water on glass. I could feel the heat of the handcuffs digging into my wrists, but I stayed still. I wasn't about to let him get to me, not in front of his partner, not in front of anyone. Then, without any warning, the officer stepped back slightly, his smile widening. The younger officer stood to the side, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression, unsure of whether to intervene or stay out of it. The older officer slapped the back of my shoulder in what he probably thought was a friendly way, but it felt more like a challenge, like he was daring me to break. "You're real tough, aren't you?" he said, his voice low, menacing now. I could hear the crackling of his radio from his belt, but it was distant, almost irrelevant. What was happening here was much more important to him. His smile was still there, but it wasn't as confident as it had been moments before. There was a flicker of something I couldn't quite place, like the faintest hint of doubt. That's when it happened. Without warning, his radio buzzed with an urgent call, one that I could barely hear over the sound of my own heartbeat. But it didn't matter. I saw the shift in his demeanor, the way his face drained of color, the way his shoulders tensed as if he were bracing for something much bigger than either of us. He didn't laugh anymore. His eyes flicked from the radio to me, and for the first time, I saw a hint of uncertainty there. The smirk was gone, replaced by something I couldn't quite read, nervousness, maybe, or just the dawning realization that he wasn't as in control as he thought. "Officer, you," his partner began, but the older cop held up a hand, cutting him off. The radio squawked again, louder this time, a commanding voice issuing orders. The urgency was clear. I could tell it wasn't just routine, this was something serious. "Stay here," the officer muttered under his breath, his hand tightening around my arm as he walked to the side of the cruiser. He was speaking into his mic now, but his voice was low, almost strained. "We need backup, now." It took everything in me not to react. I knew exactly what he was doing, trying to maintain control, trying to seem in charge. But he didn't sound confident anymore. I could tell from his shaking hand that this wasn't just about me. There was something bigger at play, something outside of his ability to handle. I glanced at the younger officer, still standing by, but now he was looking at the ground. He seemed almost embarrassed. Maybe he wasn't as blind to the situation as I had assumed. The older officer turned back to me, his face now devoid of any amusement. "You're not who I thought you were," he muttered under his breath, his eyes darting nervously to his partner and then back to me. His voice was cold now, but the shift was palpable. The cocky bravado from before had vanished. His smile, the one that had made me feel small, was completely gone. And in its place, a deep unease. "Don't move," he commanded, his voice shakier than before. The air between us had thickened, the tension hanging heavy, but there was something else now. It wasn't fear, not yet. But it was a sharp realization that this wasn't going to end the way he had expected. For a moment, all that filled the air was the crackling of the radio, the distant hum of traffic, and the uneasy silence between us. I could hear the officer's breath quicken, his fingers tightening around the mic as he spoke with more force now, his voice betraying a crack he hadn't intended. "Send backup, I need backup now." He snapped into the radio, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. The control he thought he had was slipping, like sand through his fingers. The younger officer stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable. "What's going on?" "What are you?" "Stay back," the older officer snapped, his hand held up in warning. He turned his attention back to me, but there was no mocking tone this time. No arrogance. Just the hollow look of someone who knew they were in over their head. I stood still, my chest tight with the strain of holding in everything I wanted to say. I didn't need to speak now. His every movement, every glance at his radio, told me everything. He wasn't looking at me as a suspect anymore. His focus was somewhere else, on the phone call that had just come through, on the escalating situation that was unfolding beyond his control. He wasn't thinking about the arrest or the power he thought he had over me. He was worried, and I could see it clear as day. The silence stretched on, unbearable, until the backup finally arrived. A new car screeched to a stop, tires leaving a trail of dust on the road. More officers piled out, their expressions serious. I could see the shift in the older officer's posture. He was retreating, his bravado crumbling with every new arrival. A tall officer stepped forward, her sharp gaze immediately taking in the scene. She looked from me to the older officer, then back to him again. Without a word, she reached for the radio and spoke with authority, a tone that brooked no argument. The older officer stammered, his words jumbled now. I don't," his voice trailed off as the woman officer gave him a look that said everything. She knew what had happened here. And she wasn't interested in his excuses. The woman officer stepped closer, her gaze never leaving the older cop as she approached with a calm, measured pace. The younger officer stood off to the side, silent now, no longer willing to play along with his partner's charade. "Step back," she said, her voice carrying authority, but without the harshness that had marked the older officer's words. She was focused, her eyes sharp as she assessed the situation in a way that made me feel like the tension was finally starting to dissolve. She wasn't here to humiliate anyone, she was here to resolve things. The older officer hesitated, but there was no denying that his confidence had evaporated. He shifted on his feet, unease spreading through him like a quiet sickness. His partner stood frozen, unsure whether to support him or distance himself. "Is everything okay here?" the woman officer asked, her tone even, though I could hear the underlying question of what had really just happened. I could see the weight of that question in her eyes. She was asking not just about the situation but about the way things had been handled. I thought he was. The older officer's words faltered. He couldn't finish the sentence. His posture slouched, and his eyes were now cast downward in shame. The woman officer's gaze softened, though the quiet authority remained. "You thought he was what?" she asked, taking a step closer. The older officer opened his mouth to speak but closed it again. He shook his head, as if the words just wouldn't come. The weight of his mistake was settling in, and he was painfully aware of it now. The smirk he had worn earlier. Gone. Replaced by the bitter realization that the situation had spiraled out of his control, and there was no easy way to get it back. I stood there, still, watching this unfold. I knew that things would be handled differently now, how could they not? The younger officer was looking back and forth between the woman officer and his partner, clearly uncertain but starting to grasp the gravity of the situation. The woman officer didn't say anything else for a moment, letting the silence speak for itself. Then, she turned to me, her expression softening slightly. "You're free to go," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "We'll sort this out." Her words were like a weight lifting off my chest. For the first time that evening, I felt like I could breathe again. The tension I'd been holding on to, both from the situation and from the officers who had tried to undermine me, began to dissipate. But as I walked away, I could still feel the older officer's eyes on me. His smile had vanished. And this time, there was nothing left but silence. I walked away from the scene, the steady rhythm of my footsteps blending with the quiet hum of the night. I didn't turn back, there was no need to. The woman officer had handled it, and it was over. But the air still felt heavy with everything unsaid, everything that had just unfolded. The older officer's failure was written all over his face, and though he had tried to laugh earlier, the joke had been on him in the end. The power he thought he wielded had evaporated in an instant, stripped away by the reality of his mistake and the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly how to restore order. I could hear the murmur of voices behind me as the woman officer continued to speak with the other officers. Her tone was steady, and though I couldn't hear the words, I could tell she wasn't going to let this go. She was going to make sure the situation was fully addressed. The older officer, though, was a different story. His silence spoke volumes. I could imagine him standing there, struggling to come to terms with the shift in power, the way his world had cracked in a matter of minutes. And it was all because of his own arrogance, his assumption that he could treat me however he liked without consequence. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for him. But then I remembered the way he had sneered, the way he had tried to assert control over me like I was less than human. The sympathy evaporated. The finality of the moment settled into my bones as I reached the corner of the street. The lights of the cruiser faded behind me, and with them, the harsh tension that had clouded the air just moments ago. I wasn't sure what would happen next, what consequences would fall on the officers involved. But one thing was clear, no one was walking away from this unscathed. The older officer had learned something he couldn't unlearn, and it was the kind of lesson that would follow him long after I had left the scene. And as for me, I had survived it. I had been the one to remain calm in the face of his ridicule, the one who walked away with my dignity intact. For him, that smile would never come back. But for me, I was free. Days had passed since that night, but the tension from the encounter still lingered in the back of my mind. The older officer's face, the moment his smile faltered and his confidence crumbled, kept replaying in my thoughts. It was almost surreal, how quickly the tables had turned. He'd underestimated me, thought he could dismiss me with nothing more than a laugh and a show of power. But the real power, it seemed, wasn't in his badge or his authority. It was in how you carried yourself, in your ability to hold steady when others expect you to fall apart. I hadn't heard anything more from the department. No calls, no follow-ups. I assumed the woman officer had done her job, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the older officer was still out there, somewhere. His mistake might not have ended with just an apology. I found myself walking the same route a few days later, trying to put the incident out of my mind. But something felt different now, as if the weight of that moment had changed the air itself. My steps were lighter, and for once, I wasn't bracing for something to go wrong. The unease that had followed me for years, the constant awareness of being judged by people who thought they knew me, seemed to fade a little. But as I rounded a corner, I saw him. The older officer. He stood across the street, talking to a group of civilians. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see his posture. He wasn't standing tall anymore. He looked smaller, more cautious, as if trying to avoid eye contact with anyone around him. And then, without warning, our eyes met. I wasn't sure if he recognized me or if it was just the weight of the encounter that still hung between us. But there was no laughter this time. No sneer. Just a slight flicker of recognition before he quickly turned his back, muttering something to the people around him. I stood still, watching him for a moment longer. This time, I wasn't angry. I wasn't upset. I just felt something else. There was no power in that man anymore. His confidence was gone, and what was left was nothing more than the echo of a mistake he could never undo. It was like the universe had given him a lesson he couldn't escape. And as much as I wanted to feel victorious in that moment, I realized something. He wasn't the only one who had learned something that night. I walked away from the encounter, the image of the officer still etched in my mind. It was a strange feeling, almost like I had expected something more from him, some sort of reaction, some kind of dramatic shift. But all I got was his retreat. He'd learned his lesson, that much was clear. But what did that mean for me? What was I supposed to take away from this? For the first time, I realized that it wasn't about proving something to him. It wasn't about showing him who was in control. It was about me. It was about holding on to my dignity, my peace, in a world that had tried to strip it from me over and over again. I had stood my ground when it would have been easier to fold, to give in to the power he thought he held over me. And now, he was just gone. The man who had thought he could dismiss me so easily had been reduced to a shadow of his former self. There was no satisfaction in it, no feeling of triumph. Instead, it was as though the moment had passed, and I had moved on. But still, I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't the end. He wouldn't forget what had happened. He couldn't. And neither could I. The next few days felt like a quiet aftershock. The usual worries and distractions of life took over, but there was an undercurrent of unease in everything I did. I kept wondering if that encounter would come back to haunt me. If he would try to turn the tables somehow, if he would come back at me with a vengeance for the embarrassment he'd suffered. It wouldn't be the first time someone like him had reacted that way. But when I least expected it, the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. Hello. I answered cautiously, the knot in my stomach tightening. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but there was an unmistakable tone of formality. "Is this Mr. Simmons?" the voice asked. "Yes," I replied, a bit confused. "This is Officer Williams. I'm with the Internal Affairs Department. We need to speak with you regarding an incident that occurred last week." My heart skipped a beat. I felt a chill run down my spine as the words settled in. Internal Affairs. They wanted to talk to me. A dozen thoughts ran through my mind, each one darker than the last. Had the officer somehow twisted the story? Had he lied about what happened? Or worse, were they trying to blame me for making a scene? The voice on the other end continued, undeterred by the silence on my side. "We're conducting a review of the incident, and your statement is necessary. Can you come down to the station today?" I was quiet for a moment, the weight of what was unfolding hanging heavy in the air. I had no idea what to expect, but one thing was certain, this was far from over. The events from that night, as much as I wanted to leave them behind, were clearly still echoing in the department. "I'll be there," I finally said, my voice steady, but I could feel the knot in my stomach tightening. When I arrived at the station, the atmosphere was tense but professional. Officer Williams greeted me with a nod, directing me into a small, sterile room where a table and 2 chairs sat under the harsh fluorescent lighting. The air was thick with anticipation, as if everyone in the building knew exactly why I was there, but no one was saying it. I sat across from the officer, who looked me over with a quiet, measuring gaze. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and for a moment, there was only the sound of the air conditioning humming in the background. "We've reviewed the body cam footage," Officer Williams began. And based on the circumstances, we're proceeding with an internal review. But we need your version of what happened. Your statement. I felt the weight of the moment. This was it. I could finally speak the truth, without fear of being dismissed or silenced. It had taken everything in me to hold on to my composure that night, but now, with everything in front of me, I felt the power shift. The control I had been denied for so long was in my hands. I told them everything. Every word, every moment, every feeling. The officer's mockery, his arrogance, and his eventual collapse when he realized the gravity of his mistake. I didn't hold back. I had nothing to lose. When I finished, Officer Williams nodded, taking notes but saying little. The silence between us stretched on for a moment before he spoke again. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said, his tone neutral. "We'll keep you informed about the next steps. Rest assured, this will be handled appropriately." I stood to leave, but as I turned toward the door, Officer Williams added, "Mr. Simmons, we appreciate your patience in this matter. The department's handling this, and we'll make sure it's addressed thoroughly." I left the station with a strange sense of closure, though I knew this was far from over. The officer who had once laughed in my face would now face the consequences of his actions. It wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. As I walked out into the daylight, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The world hadn't been kind to me, but that night, in that moment, I had proven that no one could take my dignity without consequence. And in the end, that was all that really mattered.